Expectations for a new Herrscher battlesuit is really high right now. We have to expect one in the next few versions. Traditionally, they've been July, but this one's late. They are the longest lasting and debatably most impactful Valkyries at the vanguard of their respective team. If you know what I just said, basically they're really strong and everyone's excited for the next one. And as much as I'd like to predict who it is or what the typing will be, my goal is just to give you guys as much information as possible. So to help you guys out, we'll be going over everything that's been happening in Honkai for the past few weeks, and we'll be going over some upcoming information that's pretty important to know. First thing to note was this new blue bow that we got last update. Hopefully you guys got it. This bow is the Cerulean Flare, and it is beyond stonks. If you guys don't know, the use case of this bow is to provide the team with a lot more SP. So this bow basically allows you to just skip SP farming altogether, which basically amounts to a 40 to 50 point advantage. The damage from Cerulean Flare is a little bit worse though. So for now, the typical case is Waltz is better. Of course, that's just right now, but we've seen fundamentally that the blue bow has more potential. Looking into the next patch, we have the HOT buff, which we'll discuss more later. So because HOT needs a lot of SP, the Cerulean Flare is used a lot more there. In fact, very few people use Waltz, so this bow is just a lot better. Since strategies are still developing, I would expect that this bow is actually just fundamentally better than Waltz. We've also seen that this bow might be pretty good on Raven. There is potential there, meaning this bow is team defining. I would say that the bow is definitely more notable on Fischl though. What was probably the most important thing last update was Pardofelis' release. We were expecting going into the update that Pardofelis would be a staple on the Ice team, which was a thing that did happen, by the way. What we didn't expect was just how damn good the cat was. First of all is her ability to be played as a DPS as well. Basically, she is actually competitive with all the other ice damage dealers. A little bit worse, but is good enough for Red Lotus. It's definitely worth celebrating if a support can be used as a damage dealer. What is probably the best thing about Pardofelis, though, is her ability to support other teams. She actually is probably one of the best supports in the entire game at this moment. She gets really easy access to one of the best multipliers in the game. All you have to do is throw out a purple swipe or an ultimate. Her ultimate giving 25 SP to the team is also, pretty helpful. And she can reapply stuff like Turgenev and Newton. She works really well in every single type of team, so she actually works on the physical team, the lightning team, and the fire team. In fact, she is so good that she kicked off Snowy for the type counter Huodo. It's actually a very big gap, which means there was a huge improvement here. Though we kind of expected this since Snowy is an ancient Valkyrie, but her performance in the fire team is actually much more impressive. In fact, she is a tier 1 fire support. That's right, in some cases she's better than Raven. She's actually one of the best fire supports in the game right now. Mainly this is due to the fact that Raven takes a long time on the field. She takes a ton of time to grind SP, and the buffs that she provides is not enough to justify it. Although Raven hasn't lost everything just yet. It's about 50-50 between her and Pardofelis. AE is pretty much always on the team though. The basic moral of the story here is that Raven's gears are not important, and you probably should ignore them for the time being. We're really looking hard for that next fire support. I'm not exactly sure when miHoYo is going to decide to release one. Obviously, the smart play here is to be waiting for the new fire support if you are looking to build a fire team. This is not entirely due to the fact that Raven is a weak character, but more that Pardofelis was obviously overtuned. One of the newer developing strategies for the lightning team is putting Pardofelis in place of Eden. The performance is actually shockingly close to Eden, and it might be better since Pardofelis provides SP to the entire team. Fischl will never have SP problems using the Cerulean Flare. Cerulean Flare will then give back SP to the entire team, which means Pardofelis will never have SP problems as well. This basically means you get infinite SP, and being low on SP will never be a problem. Though to be fair, this is most notable for HOT, who really wants to use the ult as much as possible after the new Divine Key. The point is, Felis is ridiculous. She straight up is used more on other teams other than the Ice team right now. For sure, this was a design oversight by miHoYo, and I would recommend you take advantage of it and just farm Pardofelis as much as possible. She's by far the most used Valkyrie in the entire game right now. One key takeaway is that there is a very good solution for all new players. Pair Pardofelis with Fu Hua and you're competitive for every single team for cheap. This is very cost effective and I would recommend it. The important thing is that you have her weapon though. Bast is about half her use case, though it is more future proof. You'll be using Bastet on the ice and physical teams, but you'll be using Turgenev on the fire and lightning teams. Now I want to move on to a discussion of our current update, which is version 5.7. Probably the most important thing to talk about is actually the G4 Stigmata, which is Eden Stigmata. Stigmata, in other words, Handel. This is one of the best Stigmata in the entire game. In fact, it's pretty close to Zhenyi in terms of importance. It's being used in nearly all lightning teams now. The Stigmata has capabilities as both a support Stigmata as well as a damage Stigmata, so it's very similar to Zhenyi in that regard. Both HOT and Fallen Rosemary like the Stigmata as damage dealers, and yes, Handel does actually outperform Benares and Irene respectively for the DPSs that we're talking about here. Now here's the thing about it, this is Eden's signature gears and the Stigmata doesn't actually stack with itself. This basically means you don't have to farm more than one copy. A lot of the newer teams are actually running Margrave on Eden and it actually works really well on her. This will actually allow your main DPS to take Handel if she needs it. To talk a little bit more about Eden though in context, there was actually a lot of speculation that Eden would be glued to Aponia in the past. However, we have found that this is actually not the case. Under neutral setting, it seems that Eden does outperform Azure Imperia, though because the gap between the supports is not big, you are able to mix and match them very well. The current state of lightning teams is kind of a mess, but it is good in a way that it's very flexible. If you want to know my personal thoughts on what to use, I've made a small image to show what I think is best for each combo. Each combo has its own niche, but generally the best support to gear is Fischl, which means I would say Zhenyi is still a very good supply target. The biggest reason why is because Fischl without Zhenyi is a lot worse. She will in fact fall behind all the other supports without it. The shifting of the lightning team to Eden Fischl does present a problem though. The team actually has no gather at all. Not even the two lightning elves that we currently have any gather, which means this team is not necessarily a comfortable team to play. So when gather is actually relevant, Klein is actually getting kicked out for the Durandal elf. This is definitely one of those hidden weaknesses that you can't chart out. For now, I would say this is likely something that might be solved by a new lightning elf. You're free to make your own judgment here because it's all speculation. Going back to our discussion of Eden though, she does actually have one glaring problem, and that of course is her triple S skill. Her triple S skill is probably the most important triple S skill of any SP Valk. It is a 20% total damage taken debuff. This is actually a very important debuff. In fact, it is often undiluted. This difference is basically like comparing full Margrave versus free-to-play Stigmatas on Azure Imperia. In other words, before triple S, Eden is a lot worse. Regardless though, Eden is a very strong lightning support that will be seeing a lot of play. It's just unfortunate that triple S is so important. If you guys are wondering if the guns were super important to get, don't worry about it because there was no slick deal to chase. If you are a budget player, you have a lot of time to decide whether or not you want the guns because triple S is quite a ways away. If you're not running Aponia, you won't be running Eden without that triple S skill. Before that skill is unlocked, the older supports will actually do better. Moving on, the other big thing that happened this update was the release of Aponia. Now there isn't actually much to say about Aponia because her release was actually fairly predictable. Pretty much everything we expected from Aponia did happen. So as a typical S rank release, we know that her power level is fairly high, which means she has a considerable lead on the bosses that she was meant for, namely that Su Sheng and the 3 Nihilius Husks. We also expect that Aponia will do pretty well on neutral weathers, and she'll be at least decent at fighting the Lightning Wolf as well. The honest problem though is that because there's not that many psychic bosses, bio characters are not that well off, but we can at least expect that Su Sheng will appear at least once per patch, so you can consider your own account situation if you think she's worth it or not. One conflicting factor of course is the news that HOT is getting a new sword. So the new sword is a divine key, which means it'll give your account a plus 10 attack boost. Just that alone makes it worth it for some people, but the sword itself is actually very strong. The virtue of time stop has finally been given to HOT. So of course there's the fact that you'll stop losing 20 points per animation of your ult, but there's also the fact that it's much easier to fit in your support Stigmata buffs as well. When played optimally, there's going to be a huge point gap between this weapon and the old one. There's also the fact that this weapon gives her a lot of SP regeneration as well. The controversial thing that MiHoYo has done to this weapon is that they've made a big portion of it only exclusive against mech types. So she has a 45% multiplier when she's fighting a mech. She will not get this multiplier fighting other types of enemies. They've also added a cooldown to her ultimate as well. So when we're actually placed into a lightning weather that's more neutral, such as the Lightning Tonatia boss, the limitations really become pronounced and it's hard to see HOT taking the weather from Mobius. On the flip side, this weapon makes her way stronger against mech types, so no one will come close to her on the lightning mech weathers that are coming up, and her power against mechs has risen so much that it actually does threaten HOF. Looking at the triple S tank, which is the most neutral mech that you can fight, HOT's score has risen so high that it's become very close to HOF, and if you have the Herrscher of Thunder at a higher rank, there's a chance that her score will actually just be higher. And in terms of psychic DPSs, we actually do have another very strong one, which is Alicia. She got a lot of benefit from Griseo Griseo, who has an SP leader skill, so it does make her viable in Memorial. But Alicia is another contender on the triple S tank, and she scores very well. But you should keep in mind two things. One is that there will likely be a new fire support in the future, and two, under fire weather, HOF is likely uncontested. To finish our discussion on HOT though, so like I've said before, HOT is most likely going to be taking Handel set. If you're using Eden, then she'll be running Margrave. The old Benares set is actually not bad to use still, and of course there are some niche cases where Genie can be considered. Let's actually look at version 5.8 more as a whole here. A couple minor things. First, the Nebulous gloves were actually added into the exchange shop, which is huge. If you don't have it yet, definitely exchange for it because it's one of the best weapons in the entire game. Used regularly both on the Herrscher of Sentience and Azure Imperia, which is insane. I think this is pretty much a no-brainer, I would say. Next is the Battle Pass, which features both Dea Anchora and Bright Knight. These are fairly interesting choices. I mean, they're not necessarily in demand right now. It's fairly obvious that Dea Anchora will be added into the dorm supply next. There is a possibility that she'll bring fire damage bonus. I feel like Dea Anchora's use case is just too low right now, and maybe that's because fire supports are just not good right now. She technically still holds two bosses, which is Rhymestar and the Pig. If people have her at higher rank, she's going to have a more notable advantage against HOF. The funnier thing is that we can upgrade our PE leader skill with this. After Dea Anchora, we have Bright Knight, which will be featured. You should be fairly familiar with Bright Knight by this point. She's used quite a bit more than Dea Anchora, actually. Obviously, both of these characters need their weapon. And the thing with Bright Knight is if you don't get her to double S or at least S2, the performance will be similar to Carol in Twilight Paladin or even worse. So if you invested heavily into the alternatives, you don't have to go deep into Bright Knight if you don't want to. This is definitely a good opportunity to get up to speed for cheap. So the main attraction of version 5.8 is Griseo, which is the new physical support. Of course, you might be wondering how important Griseo is to the physical team, and the answer is very important. You can expect a 20% or higher increase above the older supports. That is to say, scores are going to get a lot higher after Griseo's release. We saw scores get much higher in the first week alone. As time goes on and more people have her at higher rank, scores are going to get more ridiculous. Of course, the other question is Carol still workable? Well, Carol is still going to be best for bosses with thick shields. So if you're wondering who I'm talking about in particular, it's like Dark Shi Zhenyan. There's Shadow Knight and the Oto boss. And of course, we can't forget about our flying friend. But if there's no shield in particular, Griseo will be a lot better. It's fairly obvious to figure out where Griseo will be used, but the more interesting thing to think about is the ramifications of the physical team being this strong. There's a high likelihood in all neutral weathers the physical team will come out on top. For example, for the ranged Asaka, this will likely go back to HOV and Alicia. Then we have the Homo King. This will likely be dominated by a physical Valkyrie. Anything like this is something to think about. The question is, should you pull for Griseo's gears? And the short answer is yes. If you care about your physical team, you definitely should. I mean, it really is that simple. I'll give you guys the best devil's advocate that I can. So the thing with Griseo is that it cannot be a official scenario where she's still the best support after a year. The problem right now is that the Herrscher of Sentience is basically still a requirement, which means you still cannot play the physical team without the Herrscher of Sentience, which means if miHoYo ever decides to release another physical support, then Griseo is threatened. Of course, this is not going to happen anytime soon, probably not for another 6 months or more. I mean, literally look at Raven. There's not been a fire support in a year, so definitely make the consideration based on your account status and what you want to build. And if you're worried about a new physical support, I mean, to be fair, they did introduce a bleeding weather, so that kind of ensures she does have some use. And by the way, that is her niche. She does bleed the enemy. Honestly, wouldn't be surprised if all of these niches are being created so that you have like a sense of security with the Valkyrie. Obviously, it's something new that they're doing, so we don't really know how this is going to develop until like a few years down the line. Now, the interesting thing about the bleed is that it opens up the possibility of using Dracula mid. Now, Dracula mid, if you didn't know, gives a percentage SP back, which, as you know, SP is extremely important. So people have found success with it, though the crit rate is a lot worse, which means the variance on the damage is much higher. Basically, I don't recommend it. Depending how much SP is actually needed for the boss, this could be a quick way to get fast ults. This is certainly something that needs more time to develop so that we know more about it. The general recommendation is just to continue using Shattered Swords, though. The final thing I'll talk about is Vill-V. So Vill-V was the 5.9 Valkyrie, which we were expecting to be a Herrscher, but I guess they're delaying it to 6.0 or a later patch. We don't actually know when it's coming at this point. So Vill-V has one job to fulfill, and that is beating Nyx. Fire DPS is actually quite stacked, so it's actually fairly hard to compete there. But all of the new weathers are quantum weathers. They are not fire weathers. So it's pretty clear that miHoYo's intention is to sell her as a quantum type. The funny thing about this is Raven actually gets a lot more use here. The reason is because against quantum enemies, the quick rotation from the cat will not be helpful. We actually saw this was the case against the quantum Loach. The Nyx team actually used AE and not the cat. So similarly for Vill-V, I'm expecting that Raven will be used a lot more, which is, I guess, 5-head. Since there's going to be 3 quantum weathers, you have to expect that this is going to be a nuisance. Economically, most people haven't had the opportunity to invest in a quantum unit, the last one was Nyx. So you should expect that Vill-V is not going to be a bad choice. The problem is that 6.0 is expected to be a pretty big patch. So to be honest, that's the only thing you have to keep in mind going forward. Yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say about all the new stuff in Honkai that's been happening. Obviously, the next update we're expecting to be a Herrscher, which is a huge update. So if you are pulling for anything before the Herrscher, it should be for a pretty good reason, I would say. Hopefully all the information in this video gives you a better light on what to pull for, if anything. The thing is with the new Herrscher is we don't actually know which type it will be. So imagine it's on a team that you have absolutely no support for. Well, you're just going to be falling behind by quite a bit. As we know in Honkai, supports are pretty much crucial for teams to function correctly. So at least in my opinion, it's still better to complete functional teams. At least we saw with HOF that every other S rank was still viable and good. It's not like the past where the meta completely revolves around the Herrscher. They're just going to be solid for the whole year. Anyway, I'll save all that discussion for next month. If they actually release a Herrscher, we don't actually know if it's actually going to happen. They could break the pattern. So I'll see you guys then.